Hi everyone. You've made a bit of a start on this topic of religious organisations, and today I'm going to take you through a little bit more with regards to that and looking at in a bit more detail at some of these ways of categorising different religious organisations. I wanted to start with a little bit of a recap and just to consolidate what you have looked at already. In this beliefs topic, you have been looking at the difference between science, religion, and ideology. And hopefully you're feeling quite comfortable with the differences between those now. We've got science, which is a body of beliefs based on facts and evidence and knowledge. And then we've got religion based on faith and a belief in the supernatural. And we've got ideology, which is a set of beliefs which are sort of biased towards a particular group and which support a particular group. So once you're feeling confident with those three different belief systems, science, ideology and religion, we're going to then kind of take a bit more of a focus on religion for this term, and we're going to focus particularly on different types of religious organisation, and we're going to be thinking about how we categorise these different organisations, so how we might split them up and label them into different groups, because as sociologists that's something that we do. We try and sort of understand things by putting them into categories and labelling them so that we can talk about them. And we're going to think more about why we do this and why do we bother trying to put them into categories. And again, it's really just so that you can think about the reasons why people join particular types of different religious organisations, the ways that these different types of religious organisations have developed. And it's so that you can really understand the differences between the actual movements themselves. So you can look at the different characteristics between the different movements. So we categorise them in order to try and make sense of them, essentially, and put them into different types. We're also then going to be looking at why particular people join particular religious groups, because you find that particular people with certain characteristics tend to join similar groups. So what I mean by that is, for example, within like the Church of England and church type religions, there tends to be a more middle class membership, whereas in denominations, which are sort of branches off of churches, there tends to be a more working class membership. So we're going to be looking at that kind of thing as well, not in these two lessons, but moving forward. So far you have had a look at what we mean by a typology. So a typology is a way of categorizing things into types. So as I say, you will have watched Amy's video, you will know that there's three typologies. There's the traditional typology, there's the new religious movement typology, and there is the New Age movement typology. And each of those is looking at different religious organizations. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go into more depth. You've had a summary of the three typologies, the traditional, new religious movement and new age movement, and I just want to take some time to go into a bit more depth on that using your packs as well. So we're going to start by looking at the traditional typology. So this was introduced initially by Weber, who identified the church ideal type. So he decided to kind of define what we mean by a church and identify what the characteristics of a church religion are. And he identified that churches are religions with a clear structure and hierarchy. So this is in your packs, by the way. Clear structure and hierarchy. Usually a very large membership, as in millions of people joining and being part of the church. So these are big organisations like the Church of England, and Islam would fit into this as well. It's kind of like the traditional major religions, I guess. And they have this large membership and they have a clear structure and a hierarchy. And what we mean by the structure and the hierarchy is that they have a system of leadership. So if we take the Church of England as an example, you have the archbishops at the top, bishops and priests and vicars, and you have all these sort of people that are linked to the church, and they will all be kind of registered. There will be a paper trail. There will be this bureaucracy of how this structure works, and lists of people who are registered as kind of members of particular churches in particular areas, particular parishes and things. So yeah, large membership that's all very kind of structured and formal and has this hierarchy of leadership as well, where big decisions might be made. And some of the bishops actually sit in the House of Lords. So in that sense, there is this very like hierarchical structure where the people at the top of the Church of England actually have some power and control in government. Which brings me on to my next point. Churches are often strongly linked to the state. So the Church of England is a great example. The Queen is the head of the Church of England, and the bishops sit in the House of Lords, and therefore they can have their input on important decisions. So they would have had a massive input in particular in terms of the 2014 Same-Sex Marriage Act, and they would have given their views on that in terms of whether it could be made legal for same-sex couples to get married in a church. But not only the Church of England, if you look at Islam again as another example of a church type of organisation, they also have quite strong links to the state in places like Iran since the Iranian Revolution. The Iranian Revolution happened in 1979, and you will look at this more next year, but just for now as a kind of a really basic summary, Iran became a bit more westernized, so a bit more sort of capitalist and a bit more like our society really. There was more kind of freedom and a movement away from traditional Islamic rules and practices and beliefs. But then in 1979, fundamentalist groups staged a revolution against that, and now Iran is a very religious country, and it's actually led by an Ayatollah, which is the religious leader. It's what we call a theocracy, which means that like we have a democracy, they have a theocracy where their leaders are religious. So yeah, very much linked to the state. They mostly attract middle class members, but they are open to everyone and they are inclusive. So it's not like they only want middle class members, but they tend to attract mostly middle class members. Now, sociologists believe that this might be because they have such links to the state, and they have quite sort of mainstream values, that people who feel a bit kind of like an outsider or a bit marginalised, who might be the poor, don't tend to join them because they don't feel welcome, even if they technically are. They don't feel like they fit in, and they maybe don't agree with the values of the particular churches as well. They may believe in Christianity, but they don't believe necessarily in the actual kind of bureaucracy and the leadership of the church. And that fits in with this next point really, which is that churches tend to have a positive and tolerant attitude to wider society. So they are quite sort of happy with the world as it is, if that makes sense. And they're not in conflict with the world around them. That will make more sense in a minute when we start to look at other types. They also claim the monopoly of the truth, which means that they think they have the one truth. Churches believe that they are the only ones who are correct in their belief about God and the Bible. That is the only correct version of events. They claim the monopoly of the truth, and they won't accept other ideas as possibly true. So here we go. I've given you an image here of the Church of England. As I say, it's a really good example. And one thing that shows how kind of structured and formal they are is that this is such a recognisable image. All churches really look very much the same, and they have this, usually a man, but sometimes a woman now, usually a man at the front who is taking the sermon and preaching, wears the same robes. So they're all part of this like very official organisation, very formalised thing. Okay, the next type then was identified by Troeltsch, and Troeltsch identified sects. Now, he also identified another loose-knit type of movement, which I'm going to come to in a second, which Bruce also acknowledged later and called it cults. But let's focus on sects for now. So Troeltsch identified sects. He suggested that churches are not the only type. There's also these other much less tolerant of the world around them, much more exclusive, small, high commitment type movements as well. So in these sects, there doesn't tend to be this strong hierarchy of lots and lots of different leaders that are all kind of in power in different levels. There tends to just be the one charismatic leader. And it's important that this is a charismatic person, because often these sects are kind of encouraging people to do things that are, they take quite a lot of commitment. So quite often sects might ask people to leave behind their friends and family, to leave their job, to donate quite a significant amount of money, to actually come and live with the sect, and dedicate their entire life really to the sect. In order to convince people to do that, you need a charismatic, charming leader who's going to make it seem like the best possible option for them. But there is that one leader, and then beyond that, everyone else is completely equal. So, as I said, it requires a strong commitment. If you do keep your job, then you may have to donate a large percentage of your wages, or you may be asked to completely withdraw from society. These sects tend to be hostile towards other religions, so they completely don't tolerate other religions. Although I said previously that churches claim a monopoly of the truth, churches aren't in conflict with other religions as such, most of the time anyway. But sects will be in conflict with them, and they claim the monopoly of the truth so strongly that they almost kind of suggest that anyone who doesn't believe that are idiots and, you know, non-believers, and they're not going to survive the apocalypse or whatever. They're also very hostile towards wider society, so they tend to develop because of a leader or a group of people are sort of not happy with inequalities in society, essentially, and the way that mainstream society operates, and they think it's wrong. And so they create these communities whereby they can live in their own way and not accept mainstream society's values and norms. So for this reason, they tend to appeal to relatively deprived or marginalised groups. So as I said previously, because everyone is equal in they're kind of like mini communities and societies, they really appeal to anyone who's experienced racism or poverty, or women who've experienced sexism, because they are sold this idea of this community where they will be completely equal among everybody else. There won't be any sort of gender roles, there won't be any racial discrimination. It's a raceless and classless society. So that really obviously appeals to people who feel that mainstream society has let them down and left them feeling marginalised, which means on the edge of society, pushed out of society. However, it can sometimes appeal to successful or affluent people who feel that there's something more spiritual missing. So often people might find themselves at a period in their life where they're extremely successful, they've got everything they ever wanted, they fit in with society, but they just still feel a bit lost. And then something like a sect might really appeal to them, because they can find their kind of spiritual awakening and do something that they feel is much more meaningful for them. These often appeal actually also to any people who are kind of alone in society, who don't have family and friends, because they offer a really strong sense of community. So a really good example of a sect is Jim Jones's People's Temple. Now, you must watch a documentary on this, I think. It's really, really important example to be aware of. Jim Jones, in the middle there, was the leader of this sect, and it began really as a denomination, which we'll talk about in a second. Bit of a branch off of Christianity, and he told people, you know, if you come and join me, everyone's equal, it'll be a raceless, classless society, everything's great. He healed people in front of them and that kind of thing, and it seemed like a wonderful community. And then he was facing quite a lot of sort of media backlash and negative attention. People were suggesting that he was assaulting members and taking advantage of the women within the community and things like that. So he decided to create what he called Jonestown, which was is it South America or Central America? I can't quite remember, but this rural, like, empty land, he set up a community there. He built this community that he called Jonestown, and he took all of his followers with him. And they all lived there in this community, and he tried to present this image to the outside that they were all there of their free will, and that it was this lovely like haven of equality, and they just sort of, you know, lived off the land and supported each other, etc. But people within it were starting to kind of suggest that they weren't able to leave and that kind of thing, and family members of those people that were there started to be concerned. So the media again got hold of it and went to visit. Anyway, so long story short, in the end, I guess he was sort of concerned about the amount of negative attention that he was getting, and he had speakers that went out over the whole sort of camp, and over those speakers he asked for every member of his following to drink this drink, and in the drink was cyanide. So he was basically asking them to take their own lives and to give it to their children and their babies. And lots of people got away, and now there's this documentary about it, but loads of people died. It's a very, very tragic story. But yes, really good example of a sect and how they can be so appealing to marginalised people, but also how they command this like huge commitment, in this case actually moving away and then ultimately taking your own life. I'll send you the link for a documentary. Next we have got cults, or Troeltsch called this mysticism. So we had Weber, who said that there was churches, and then we had Troeltsch, who said actually there's sects as well, but then there's also these other movements that are a bit like spiritual and a bit more kind of loose commitment, that kind of thing. And Troeltsch called those mysticism, which I think is quite a nice term for them. Bruce came along and called them cults instead. They're basically the same thing. So these are less structured, they're very loose knit, you can like dip in and out of them, you don't have to sort of join and then be in it forever, you can do it for a bit, then stop and la la. There's no hierarchy or organisation within them. They have a much smaller membership than churches do, and they don't have any links to the state. They still mostly attract middle class members though, and the reason for that is that to engage in their spiritual activities really, they tend to cost more money, and therefore the poorest members of society won't be able to spend money on those things, won't be able to afford to do them. So therefore it does tend to still attract middle class members. But they are very tolerant of wider society and other religions. You could be a member of a church and also a member of a cult, and the cult would be fine with it. Now, this is a really important point. You will have probably heard the term cult in a very different way in the media, in films and things. Things that we categorise as sects, these sort of like dark, high commitment, problematic communities. In films and TV shows, they're often referred to as cults. But you've got to try and remember moving forward that in sociology, that is a sect, and cults are actually these very loose-knit, low commitment, quite positive spiritual practices that people do. And they focus on self-fulfillment and success very often. They're about like individual spirituality, much more than the collective sort of practices. They're more about individuals using spirituality to better themselves and to sort of find fulfillment within themselves. So I think that yoga fits this ideal type quite well. And there are people that would disagree with me, because I guess yoga does go beyond what I'm about to talk about, in that yoga does have sort of its leaders in some ways. But the way I personally experience yoga is that I do it at my gym sometimes, and I do it at home sometimes. I certainly don't do it every day. I find it really useful in terms of like the breathing exercises and that kind of thing. Do I necessarily see it as a spiritual thing? Not always, but I guess I benefit from it in the spiritual sense of like almost like a meditation, and sort of taking a moment to breathe and just be mindful and be in the moment. However, as I say, I'm not very committed to it. I just do it kind of as and when I fancy. No one's telling me that I need to leave my job or whatever to join a yoga community. I don't have to do it religiously every Sunday or anything like that. So in that sense, yoga can be a really good example of a cult, because you can pick it up as and when you wish to, but you don't have to. There's no real commitment. However, of course, it does cost money. To join an actual yoga class can be really expensive. As I say, I just do it at my gym. I have to have a gym membership in order to do it. There are good videos online and things, but if we ignore that side of it, someone still have to have access to the internet in order to access those free videos. And, you need some level of income in order to access yoga, really. So that's why it might appeal more to sort of the middle classes. Lastly, then, we have denominations. So NIBA identified denominations. So NIBA found that these other typologies had missed this other type of religious organisation that didn't fit neatly into those categories. So NIBA argued that there were these movements that were a little bit like a church, but had elements of being like a sect as well. And he called these denominations. So these are something in between a sect and a church. They're not as committed as a sect. They're not as sort of hostile as a sect, but they're not as mainstream as a church, and they're not as hierarchical and structured as a church. They're usually a bit of a branch, an offshoot of a traditional church, but they're less bureaucratic and less organised. Anyone can preach within a denomination. There's this practice of lay preaching, layman doing the preaching. Layman is like a term for just a normal person. So yeah, anyone can preach within a denomination. You don't have to be sort of called by God to be a vicar or whatever. Anyone can preach within denomination, so it's much less formal and structured. Denominations tend to have no links to the state, so they're not like the Church of England, which is heavily linked to the state in various ways. They are quite sort of standalone, really. My understanding of the example that I'm going to give you of Pentecostalism is that each Pentecostal church almost has its own rules and its own ways of practicing things. They have things in common, but they're quite sort of individual little communities, which I guess makes them is almost a characteristic of a sect. They require some level of commitment, like restrictions on things like alcohol, which some churches do as well. But in denominations, they might be a little bit more stricter in terms of controlling the lives of their followers and wanting their followers to do specific things and live life in a particular way. Importantly, where I said previously that churches are quite accepting of mainstream values and they try and uphold them, and where churches are quite sort of positive about wider society, conversely, sects are the extreme opposite and very hostile to wider society and in conflict with the mainstream values of society. Denominations are neither of those extremes. And the reason for that is they almost separate themselves from wider society. They're almost kind of not interested in wider society because their main focus is on their spiritual journey and their spiritual experiences. So whereas churches will actually sort of comment on and be involved in mainstream issues, such as bishops being involved in whether or not same-sex marriage could be legal, and churches being kind of known for promoting like traditional values and mainstream values, and whereas sects will be quite sort of in conflict with mainstream values and completely separate, denominations will neither be in conflict or in affirmation of wider society, because instead they don't really comment on it and they focus on their spirituality and their religious experiences rather than the real world. So that's sometimes tricky. I personally find that a bit tricky to get my head around sometimes, but yeah, they're neither affirming of mainstream society or rejecting it. They're just focused on their spirituality. They are tolerant of other religions, and they don't claim the monopoly of the truth, so that's something that they don't have in common with either a church or a sect. They're a bit more kind of open to the idea that there are other beliefs out there and other ways of doing things. And the main thing with denominations really is that they tend to appeal to people who feel disillusioned with mainstream churches. So what that means is people who feel that mainstream churches aren't necessarily doing things right. They're not focused enough on the spiritual, for example. So if we have a look at an example, just to help me explain that a little bit more. This is an example of a Pentecostal church, and you can see it's a little bit more jazzy than your traditional church. And in these churches, Neo-Pentecostalism in particular, there's this practice of speaking in tongues, which means sort of speaking as if a spirit is speaking within you, as if a spirit has sort of possessed you, and then you're speaking in this like celestial, godlike language. To really understand it, you're going to have to Google it and try and watch some videos of it. So these Pentecostal churches are so much more focused on the spiritual experience. So if you think of like a typical church community, they do their Sunday service and things, but then they also have like cafes for the community, and they hold like charity things like fetes and fairs and things like that, bake sales and all that kind of thing. The church community will get involved in sort of being active citizens and trying to make things better in the community. But in a denomination, they're not interested in that, and that's why they may have left a traditional church to join a denomination, because the denomination is purely focusing on this spirituality aspect of the religion and really getting kind of in depth in that. And as I say, one of their practices is speaking in tongues, and if somebody wants to do that, then a preacher will they perform these rituals where they believe that they are then become possessed with a spirit, and they can then speak in tongues. So yeah, got to do some research on it. This is also, Pentecostalism in particular, has appealed to black communities who have felt that the mainstream church is very white, basically white and middle class, and therefore kind of like not accepting of black culture. So Pentecostal churches might involve like gospel choirs and things like that, and different ways of practicing, and much more sort of acceptance and much more liberalism in terms of welcoming all different types of people into the church, as opposed to Church of England, which is sometimes seen as being a bit more exclusive and not really wanting that much diversity. Pentecostalism has developed for people that feel unwelcome in the church. So that's what we mean by a denomination, like a bit of an offshoot of a traditional church. Pentecostalism is a good example. So to finish off for this lesson, what I would like you to do is I would like you to use the internet to read and watch videos about each of the examples of each traditional type from page 12 in your pack. So there's a couple of examples for church, denomination, sect and cult. Now some of them you might already know the answers to, like you might feel you already know a lot about Church of England. I'd really recommend using YouTube to find out about the ones that you don't know about, because I think it just brings them to life a lot more rather than reading about them. However, the Wikipedia page on Pentecostalism and the history part of it is really useful. Talks a lot about how Pentecostalism was involved in sort of the civil rights movement and anti-racism protests and things like that. So yeah, very interesting. And I want you to get yourself a separate piece of paper, find out about at least one example from each type to make sure that you understand a little bit about them. It's not that you need to know all of the ins and outs of all of their beliefs, but you need to know enough that you can use them as an example in an essay. So you need to know, when did they originate, excuse the typo there, and do they still exist? For example, Jim Jones and the People's Temple doesn't exist anymore because they all died. Who is or who was the leader? What is the hierarchy of leadership like? Do they have like lots of people within the leadership, like vicars, or do they have one leader or no clear leader? What's going on? And what are their kind of basic beliefs and practices? What makes them different from other religious organisations? So for like Church of England, you would write that they believe in the Bible and God and Jesus, and their practices are that they attend church every Sunday, people will be christened, people will be married in the eyes of God, and that kind of thing. So just like a couple of sentences really about the lives and the practices of the people within that particular organisation. Okay, so that's it for today, and I will be sending you another video for your next lesson, which is looking at the next type. I hope you found this helpful. I've tried to just talk as I would in lesson. I feel like I've rambled a little bit, but yeah, it might be worth listening to this like a podcast. Anyway, thanks very much, everyone. Enjoy.